Now I want to try completing a square on a different variety. It's still the same type of problem. It's a quadratic equation. We're going to solve this by completing the square. The same process stays in place. The first thing I want to do is I'm really just grouping those x's. I'm going to rewrite it with the x's grouped negative 2x squared minus 5x grouped. I got to leave a spot to complete the square plus 12 equals 0. So I'm grouping the x's. The other thing that we need to do is always make sure that our leading coefficient is a 1. If it's not a 1, we're going to have to factor it out of the set of parentheses that we put in there and make it a 1 so that we can complete the square. So really what I'm going to do is I'm going to factor out a negative 2. And when I factor out a negative 2, I'm really dividing by negative 2. So negative 2 divided by negative 2 is x squared. I force this to be a 1, which is my grand scheme of this whole design here. And then I want to take and divide a negative 5 by negative 2, which is going to be a positive 5 over 2. You really don't want to work with decimals. Fractions are your friends in these problems, so leave it as fractions. Plus 12. Now that was an added step we didn't have in the previous example, so what you got to remember is when you have something other than a leading coefficient of 1, you're going to have to factor it out, and when you factor it out, you're going to have to divide them both by negative 2. So in essence, I divided both of these by negative 2, and it gave me 1 and 5/2. Okay, now my next step that we're going to do is we're going to complete the square. To complete the square, what we do is we always take half of this linear term. So I'm going to pull it out of here. Here's the linear term, 5/2. We're going to take half of it. Now to me, taking half means multiply by half, which is 5 over 4, and then we square it. When we square that, we get 25/16. So what we want to do is we want to add 25/16 in this location, and since we added it there, I should have left a little spot over here, we have to balance out the equation by keeping it completely in balance. Now, the extra little added feature in this one is we really didn't just add 25/16 because it's being multiplied by this negative 2. We'd have to distribute the negative 2 to get the true value. So we really, in order to keep it balanced, have to put in negative 2 times 25/16, which is going to be a negative 50/16. But I want to offset it, so I want to add it. This one here gives us a negative 50/16, so I want to offset it by adding 50/16. And we've got to add that to 12. Okay, so now we've got it set up where we completed the square. Now we're going to factor our trinomial. So this thing sitting in here is a trinomial that we can factor into trinomial squared. I'll write two factors again. It's x times x is x squared. The factors of 25/16, that gives us 5/2. It's always the square root of each of these, so it is 5/4. 5/4, or it's always just half of that linear term. Those are the numbers we need there. Since our sign is positive, we know that they have to be the same, and they're plus. So I'm going to write that right away as negative 2 times x plus 5/4 squared. Now I'm going to continue on with the simplification over here. Since fractions are our friends, I'm going to have to make sure I convert that into a fraction, so it's going to be plus. I can't add unless I have a common denominator, so I'm going to have to make sure that I rewrite that as a common denominator. So it's going to be over 16, so it's going to be 192 over 16 plus 50/16 equals 0. And then we can add those up. So 192 plus 50 is 242, so plus 242/16 equals 0. As you can see, putting a leading coefficient in there makes things a little bit more complicated. Also, I made sure that I had this as a negative because we had to keep it balanced. We had to add it over here at 50/16. So that's a little spot that a lot of people get stuck in. Well, now we're to the point where we can solve this, and hopefully we can move things around and transform it into a solvable equation. So in order to solve this, we have to undo the addition first. So it's going to be negative 2 times x plus 5/4 squared equals a negative 242/16. Then I want to undo multiplying by negative 2. To undo multiplying by negative 2, you can think of it as dividing by negative 2. I prefer to multiply by its reciprocal, so multiply by negative half. So I'm going to multiply both sides by a negative half, and this side by a negative half. And half of a negative 2 is 1, and the negatives will cancel, so we'll have x plus 5/4 squared equals, and then I have to take a negative half times a negative 242, so that's going to be a positive. If you take half of 242, it's 121 over 16. Okay, so now we're getting closer. So now we want to undo our squaring. To undo the squaring, you square root, so it's going to be x plus 5/4 has to equal a plus or minus. Every time we take the square root of a constant, we have to worry about both the positive and negative value of a 121 over 16. So that means x plus 5/4 would have to equal a plus or minus 11/4. Almost home. We're going to add the 5/4 to both sides. So we add 5/4 to 11/4. Do the plus or minus 11/4. Do the indicated, there's two operations here. One is 5 plus 11, or 5/4 plus 11/4, which is 16/4, or one of our answers is 4. The other one is 5 minus 11, or 5/4 minus 11/4, or it's 5 minus 11, and 5 minus 11 is a negative 6 all over 4, which we could reduce down to negative 3/2. There's our second solution. So the solution set to this, and we did this by completing the square, were the two values 4 and a negative 3/2. I wanted to show you how involved they can get. Again, there's things here that I want to point out to you just to reiterate some key things you don't want to drop. Number one, group them. After you group them, make sure this leading coefficient is a positive 1. If it's not a positive 1, you simply divide by whatever that number was. It was a negative 2, I pulled it out. Then ignore it for the moment. Complete your square on your linear term. Take half, 5/2, which is 5/4. Square it, it's 25/16. So we took half the linear term, squared it, put it in there. Now we want to balance the equation. Keep in mind, we didn't just add 25/16, we added negative 2 times that. So that's where we had that negative 50/16. So we had to balance our equation and add 50/16. Okay, and that seems to be the biggest point of contention on those problems that are a little bit more sophisticated, and making sure that we monitor those steps appropriately. So a little stepped up version of completing the square.